Good afternoon, Negar. We are so excited to have you here at Jadaliyya Talks, and we are joined here by Jadaliyya co-editor Noor Aliqat, and my name is Bassam Haddad. You apparently have written an article that kind of broke a small part of the internet, and that is something that we are very happy about. It comes as a function of the new Iran page, and the title of the article is The Systemic Problem of Iran Experts in Washington, D.C. So before we move forward and take a look at some of the quotation marks or the quotes, I guess, quotation marks, the quotes, and looking at some of the Twitter activity that actually reflected the interest in the article, mostly very supportive, some critiques which we'll address. We'd like to get you to say a few words about why you wrote this article and how you feel the responses were in terms of what they fared. Do you feel that you put your point across? And did people focus on the wrong thing? Because there was a lot of focus on one aspect, and a lot of the other aspects actually were left kind of like not addressed by some of the Twitter activity or social media activity.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Bassam and Nora. This is very nice of you. And for giving me an opportunity to write a longer form piece of something that I've been sitting on for a while. So to give a little bit of background, I'm an anthropologist by training, and this is part of a broader dissertation project that I'm hoping to turn into a book about the politics of knowledge production in Washington and the role of think tanks in particular in shaping Middle East policy. And so my case studies in my research were Iran policy and Egypt policy, and I decided really to write this piece about Iran first to a non-academic audience, but an engaged audience that straddles both worlds, because of a lot of the discourse that's going on in Washington that's against Trump's maximum pressure strategy that still reproduces some of the problematic, let's say, frameworks that are underlying that maximum pressure strategy. So I wanted to write a piece that's taking a longer history of the ecosystem of so-called Iran experts in Washington.
And what were some of your basic arguments before we delve into more discussion of the content?
Within this article, or yeah. So I was essentially trying to point out that there's not an individual problem of experts. There's not a problem of one or two people who are out there who are very polemical in their research. It's a broader culture of expert impunity, as I say in the article, where there's not a lot of attention being brought to who is claiming to be an Iran expert, the kinds of evidence they're bringing forward, and what kinds of assessments they're bringing to a country that is really at the forefront of US policy in the Middle East right now, and has been for a long time. And so that's my argument, is that this is a systemic problem. It's not a problem of one or two individuals, so-called bad apples. It's about, there are some very good people in the think tank community working on Iran, but overall the discourse is skewed, and that's what I wanted to draw attention to.
Wonderful. Before we get into any of the Twitter feed or any of the social media, I'm just going to ask you to comment a little bit about some of the quotes that we actually have pulled out from the article itself. So the first quote is, "If we wish to see a durable change in US policy toward Iran within the establishment, we must demand a higher standard of expertise on a country that has preoccupied these foreign policy circles for the better part of 2 decades." Is this something that you feel just applies to Iran? And of course you can talk about the Iranian case, but we come from a perspective whereby this, Noura can probably opine quite a bit about this, whereby this doesn't simply apply to Iran.
Yeah, great question. Obviously, I wanted to start where I was most comfortable and where I had the most data, because in some ways I want to do the type of expertise I'm demanding of the people in Washington, which is I spent 2 years closely following Iran experts and Egypt experts. And yes, this can be applied to so many other countries in the region, but as I tried to show, you shouldn't talk about things that you didn't actually study. And so Yes, I think there's a lot that you could take from this about other communities. People have told me they've found a lot of what I had to say about a lot of countries.
Absolutely.
But again, I sort of want to enact my own argument in my own expertise, which is that this is the community I studied, and so I can make these kinds of judgments and assessments.
So accountable scholarship of what you know, what you're preaching, and how you're.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is the structure of the think tank community around Washington, and the way not only that it doesn't celebrate scholarship and the scholars who are studying this work and that expertise, but in addition to that is creating a relationship between the think tank world and the administration.
That's right.
So that there's a feedback loop that also, it's reinforcing itself. It's a circle that continues to complete itself.
Absolutely. And, if people would sort of put those biases out in front, it would sit better, I think, with people. And it would be a more honest and transparent and accountable discussion about Iran, which is, listen, I used to work on Iran policy inside the government, and that's my perspective, and that's what the biases I'm bringing to this project. Instead of trying to act as if you're objective and disinterested and you're just an outsider who has no stake in the final policy. That's where I'm sort of trying to raise questions. More than anything, I'm trying to raise questions that should be happening within Washington.
This idea of objectivity.
Yeah.
There is no objectivity.
And neutrality. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
So we have another. All right. So this is another quote from the article. The U.S. foreign policy establishment has collectively created a culture of expert impunity when it comes to Iran, which has contributed in small part to the unstable and dangerous policy conditions we see under Trump today. So this is, again, this discussion of impunity and lack of accountability. Can you say more about this, given that you also later on say something about the type and nature of the expertise and the dearth of understanding of the Iranian culture and language and so on?
Absolutely. And I think this quote points to the longer history that I was alluding to earlier, which is that, yes, Trump sort of brings to light the worst versions of what I'm talking about. He does that across the board in a lot of policies.
He's good like that.
Yeah, he's good like that. But to say that this is a unique, exceptional moment because of Trump is problematic.
Precisely.
Most of my research was done under the Obama administration. I essentially watched the Iran nuclear deal be negotiated during my fieldwork. And I found as much lack of interest in truly understanding the complexities of Iran under that administration, even as they were making moves to open up with Iran on the nuclear issue. Yet they would continuously cede certain narratives about Iran to their opponents and just let them linger there, without challenging them.
So this was really interesting in your article. There were two things on this point, and I love that you highlight the non-exceptional nature of the Trump administration, which a lot of the resistance does inadvertently or advertently.
Yeah.
But one was highlighting that once that they were in negotiations over a nuclear agreement, the need for expertise on Iran disappears. All they want to talk about now is how to negotiate a nuclear agreement.
Right.
Nobody cares. Well, what are the complexities and the nuances that would make this more worthwhile?
Yeah.
And then there was the other thing that you said was that you can't trust an Iranian. There's trust, but there's no trust, but verification.
Verification, right.
Which, as you rightly point out, is then, subsumed by the Trump administration and taken to a new level.
Right, exactly. I'm glad you raised both of those. This trope of the inherently dishonest Iranian was something that the Obama administration really didn't try to tackle. They may have done it through their actions, but they didn't try to change the narrative in Washington about it. And then similarly, sort of the experts that supported the negotiations would cede that point as well and say, yeah, they can't be trusted. That's why this deal is about verification, not trust. And that's in itself problematic, because then Trump can pick up on the idea that Iranian leaders are liars to say, what's the point of even having this deal with them?
Which is clearly what's happening. But Negar, can you tell us a little bit, was that Was that just something that the Democratic administration was seeding in order to move this along?
Yeah.
Did they believe it? Is it just an inherently racist trope that, will persist?
Yeah.
What were your findings?
Yeah, so Wendy Sherman was, I quoted her quote that she said, deception is part of the Iranian DNA. She apologized for that, so I will give credit where credit is due. She apologized for that statement. And in their actions with the Iranians, the Obama administration made a lot of headway in terms of showing some respect to their counterparts. But again, you can't do these things behind closed doors and then expect that what you've done has transformed the common sense in Washington. Right. That narrative needed to go outside into the public. You know what I mean? To say, no, listen, they are rational actors as much as any other regime has rational actors.
And for years I've been, when I talk about this question of Iran and nuclear weapons, I've always insisted that not everything that is being produced by the establishment, the political establishment, is necessarily internalized by the political establishment. Right. There is a lot of messaging for an audience who is more ready than the establishment to distrust. In other words, the elites, if you will, the political establishment, the leadership, whoever is producing this messaging, is perhaps more aware that Iran is a rational actor at the end of the day. Right. But the knowledge, the recognition that there is fertile ground, within the audience, the broader audience, that they are addressing for believing otherwise, that this whole idea starting from even before the war on terrorism, this culture of death, they have a culture of death, we have a culture of life, and so on and so forth. There's this idea that you could exploit these sorts of perceptions by basically putting forth this uncertainty, even though you know much better, because it gives you leverage in terms of taking action if that is the conclusion.
Exactly, and really you've hit the nail on the head here, which is where the Iran experts came in after the nuclear negotiations was to amplify the message to the American people. So after the deal was signed, the JCPOA was signed, that's when the Iran experts in DC played a huge role, because what they did was they either produced a narrative in favor of it or against, and they sort of call it like the battle of the Iran experts after the deal was signed. And across the board, where they agreed was that this is not about verification, this is not about them being rational actors that we trust, even though internally within the Obama administration, they had obviously come to that conclusion themselves, otherwise they wouldn't have. But in the messaging that happened after, it all became, no, this is about, we made the deal so airtight that there's no way they can cheat.
It was like
in their inner nature,
they took for granted this Islamophobic trope, and you built on this, using taqiyya
exactly
as a way to understand all Shia, not even just Iranians, but all Shia, and internalize it because they wanted to win the point politically, even though it was self-destructive.
Yeah, and as you all know, and maybe our viewers know, like that is one of the favorite tropes right now of Islamophobic groups.
You're assuming that there are viewers. We don't know that.
Well, why don't we tell our non-viewers? Do you want to explain to them the taqiyya trope? To nobody watching.
We always tell our guests not to get their hopes up.
Okay, no, that's fair. I was trying to acknowledge them, all two of them. Well, I'm not an expert on taqiyya, but how it's been sort of used in the Islamophobic spaces is to say that there's this practice where you can hide your identity from an oppressive ruler if it protects your community. And this was often used historically by the Shia community. If they were ruled by a Sunni leader, they could hide the fact that they're Shia in order to stay safe. What taqiyya has to do with everyday Iran? It's a good question.
It's the creeping Sharia.
It's the creeping Sharia.
Yeah, they're all hiding and they're gonna come with us.
Yeah.
Even the secular ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Now we get to the that part of the article that sort of was taken and catapulted up and
Yeah.
blown into the
Yeah.
universe.
Yeah.
Around half of the Iran experts based at think tanks in DC could not read, write, or speak Persian at the time of my fieldwork. A similar number had never once stepped foot inside Iran, and of course, that created a Twitter storm, if you will.
Did it?
But for the most part, people were supporting. I mean,
Yeah.
we have traced thousands of tweets and retweets and likes, and a handful, more than a handful of critique of this notion. And we'll get to the tweets
Yeah.
right now. But tell us about the significance of this and how you meant it before we get
Yes.
to how it was perceived or misperceived.
Yes. This was a humbling exercise for myself in that things can just get pulled out of a article and take on a life of its own. So it was important for me to sort of see how that works in practice. When I was originally writing this, I thought this was going to be such a small part of what I was trying to say. But it obviously hit a nerve because it is a conversation that many people have been having about Iran experts for a long time, quietly amongst themselves, including some of the people who get called Iran experts and who are uncomfortable with that label. They have had those conversations quietly amongst themselves as well. For me to sort of put that fact out there so baldly, I think hit a nerve. And we can get to the issue of accessing Iran, which I think is complicated. And I didn't get to unravel the complexity of it as much as I wanted to in the piece. But the language issue is one where I'm going to stick by what I said and say that it raises questions, let's put it that way, of why people would call themselves an Iran expert specifically and not attempt to understand the language.
But there's this thing in your piece that was so striking, even for me as someone who understands that there's a feedback loop, da. And forget the language part. And for me, I could care less if you want to call yourself an Iran expert. But if you are commenting on this, you gave this horrifying example where somebody who can read Arabic letters, so they didn't understand Persian, but they can read the text, was speaking to someone who understood Persian, but could not read. And then that translation, so the reading, the non-Persian speaking reader was speaking to the listener, who then would translate it to the expert. So we're talking about it's been mediated through several, I would say inadequate steps to get to the point where now it's expertise and knowledge.
And that one's a really illustrative example, and it's one of the reasons why I think anthropology is a good way to approach this topic, because I didn't just study or meet with the experts, and I met with many of them, not all of them, but I also met with a lot of the research assistants and a lot of the interns, and there is some anger there because they are oftentimes brought in to be the language experts and to be the country experts, and yet their names don't get published anywhere. They don't get any credit for the really heavy lifting work that they do. And this story was from someone who speaks and reads Arabic fluently. And he was working with a second generation Iranian American who could understand but couldn't read. And that gets to all the kinds of complications that happen in diasporic communities. But the sad part is their names will never be published in reports. No one will ever know who they are, even though they're doing the heavy lifting of the work. And of course, that's the most absurd story, and yet not the only one I've heard.
Are there others just the mediation? How much is literally lost?
How much is lost? And especially because high-level newspaper Farsi is not the Farsi that you would, someone who only is a heritage speaker would even be able to get to. So even what is lost there.
Exactly.
So.
We'll just take a small commercial break and we'll be back. Actually, I'm joking. There's no commercials. Nobody's sponsoring this. I'm just practicing. Yeah, nobody's going to sponsor this episode. That's
we can walk through with a bunch of books. Newly released books.
Yeah, exactly. We should bring out your, your work.
Our last slide before we go to the Twitter feed that was prepared just to go over some of the responses. Our last slide is also from the article. With Iran, policy experts in DC circulate ideas in and out of the foreign government until they take on the status of unquestioned truth.
Yeah.
Discuss.
Yes. So this is the larger finding of my work beyond Iran, which is that what is the role of these think tank experts? There's sometimes a false argument that one expert is influencing X policy and that's what their role is. No, they're part of this ecosystem of knowledge, and together they circulate ideas through social media, through memos that get circulated at the lower levels of the bureaucracy and then make their way up through reports that they do. And then these ideas just keep circulating until they become unquestioned truths. And that was a big point that I wanted to bring is like this. I'm not talking about, X person at X think tank says one thing and that's what changes Iran policy. I'm talking about over 10 years, people will say something and it just keeps getting repeated until no one can even find out where the original source of that piece of information was, because no one has asked for the chain of evidence. Nobody has asked, where did we even get this idea? They're not asking those basic questions that good scholars or good experts are supposed to be able to stand by and say, listen, this is how I found this piece of data, this was my methodology, this is my evidence.
So maybe citations are
important, yeah, or even methodology.
I love the fact that you use an ecosystem of knowledge.
Yeah.
That you're offering it to us to think about that this, in knowledge production, that there is this ecosystem and you're looking at both the written, the policy memos, the social media. In your scholarship and kind of wherever you're at right now in your writing, have you articulated what this, a way to think about this process, this, this, what becomes unquestioned truth?
Yeah.
Is there, some way that we can think of it as a process? Is there?
Yeah, so it is something that I'll be writing about in the book, but I trace a policy from beginning to end, and so what I have is someone will, write a report on a topic that's from a think tank. Then a desk officer in state will pick up 3 or 4 quotes from that report and then sort of send it up the ranks within the bureaucracy. And then simultaneously, that expert will go on CNN or whatever, and then quick clips of that show will circulate on social media, and then suddenly it just becomes a phrase. It can be as simple as a phrase that just becomes unquestioned. And that will just circulate both from the outside and the inside. And I tried to give an example of the Houthis in Yemen, but there are many others that there's sort of these sound bites that get picked up and these unquestioned
truths. Are these also mediated by personal relationships between the desk officers and these experts?
Absolutely, absolutely. And maybe at the higher levels, not the desk officers. At the higher levels, it's definitely like, I know this person, we went to school together. Again, this is where anthropology helps, is, their kids go to the same schools, they all sort of know each other. And so I'm bound to trust what you say a little bit more because I know you and so that it's something very human in all of that as well.
A lot of what you discussed is something that we have actually come across in our work at ASI's Knowledge Production Project.
Yeah.
That traces, of course, several databases of knowledge production on the Middle East. One of them is the Think Tanks database, coordinated and run by Kylie Broderick, who's also the managing editor of Jadaliyya.
Great,
and she's the awesome person that selected these quotes for us.
Yeah.
We will actually come back to you at some point as we address this vis-a-vis other countries and bring data into it and look at the ups and downs in terms of expertise on Iran, not just in terms of the experts themselves, but also in terms of the number of reports across the years, and also in terms of how these Iran experts, just like the other experts on questions of Israel-Palestine, questions of even local matters here, but mainly Middle East matters, how they actually circulate throughout media, academia, government, and think tanks, and you begin to see why actually everything you're saying makes sense, because it's actually I'm not saying it's the same group or the same clique, but the core of a lot of these folks is the same. They get academic jobs. They become the experts on TV, whether it's CNN, Fox, or otherwise.
Yep.
They then get posts in universities to teach courses just because they can say a few things about Iran,
Yep.
and they're recruited by security studies programs who know that this will actually attract students.
Yeah.
And then of
Practitioner
course,
scholars.
and then they go back to think tanks, and we can
Or
name,
back into the government.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, this rotation is actually very interesting. We will come back to it when we are able to
Wonderful.
make some comparisons. Before we
would
go
be
to our
great.
Twitter feed,
Yeah.
this is what we started with.
Yeah.
And we're gonna end with it, which is basically that there is a demand for higher standard, and I think that is something that, of course, applies across the board.
Yeah.
The question is, I mean, and that's sort of when I read the article, and we really enjoyed it. We're very excited about publishing it. Part of the bottom line is why. I mean, that's our demand. People who actually know Iran and,
Right.
and know that it needs to be studied
Right.
on its own terms, like we
Right.
say at Jadaliyya about everything
Yeah.
about the Middle East. But why should they? I mean, why should there be a
Right.
change? I mean,
Right.
is there an argument to make without sort of saying, oh, from an American interest perspective, that's, I mean, why should a change be made? I mean,
Right.
there's no reason to make a change
From their perspective. you
yeah,
mean.
from the establishment's perspective.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that when you keep listening to the same people over and over again, or to the same set of ideas, and you don't question underlying assumptions about someone you're calling your enemy, potentially your greatest enemy in the region, and you're listening to the same people, you're not really questioning these ideas, and the policies aren't working, like that's where the question should be raised. Like even according to your own objectives, you're failing. And maybe there's something to be said about having people come and ask those difficult questions about US policy, about the assumptions we make, that will make you achieve your goals more effectively.
But that also assumes that the goals are actually decent ones, and
I
in
was-
reality, the
yeah.
goals are probably more to dominate basically.
Because in many ways, maybe this is the goal. I mean,
Maybe
whole
the goal is to-
foment this, lack of stability.
Yeah.
The whole goal is to create
Lack of
a
trust.
boogeyman and
Right.
a straw man
Right.
out of Iran in
Right.
order to
Right.
continue to, in the words of Condoleezza Rice, create a new Middle East.
Right.
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 And create like all this evidence, quote unquote,
Yeah.
or all this sort of almost chaos to justify action.
Right.
Uncertainty,
Right.
lack of trust to justify action. In that sense, they're doing a great job.
Yeah.
No, I'm joking. Actually, they're not doing a great job. You know why? I'll tell you why. Because in 2004, 5, 6,
Yeah.
when there were a lot of calls to bomb Syria after the fraudulent invasion of Iraq, there were calls to bomb Iran and
Yes.
Syria and so on. And the public, and of course, just like we know,
Yeah.
local leaders know from polls, from major
Yeah.
institutions that there is no appetite for any of this.
Absolutely.
And it is not unrelated to the fact that people are not drinking the Kool-Aid
That's right.
as much.
That's right.
And this is why I think this article has rung true with so many people,
Right.
frankly, that are not necessarily quote-unquote radical about the critique of U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
But this rang true with them.
Well, let me ask you
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
a question. 'Cause you said something in the beginning
Yeah.
about, let's not exceptionalize the Trump administration. But how
Yeah.
much of the cachet of this article with the establishment is precisely because
The
people
Trump-
are in opposition to Trump and the
Right.
fact that he's disemboweled
Yeah.
the JCPO?
Yeah. So there's probably an element of the people who are supporting this article that normally wouldn't if it was a Democratic president. But I again, one of the things, I don't mean to keep plugging anthropology, but one of the humbling things that it does. Yeah.
We can edit this
You
out.
can keep editing that out, yeah. No, but I want to get to the point of, one of the humbling things that happened here is I didn't go in to prove a hypothesis. I truly went in as an inductive researcher, and I met some people who were making exactly the critique I'm making from within. They're just not empowered enough, or there's the wrong incentive structures, and that's why I called the whole thing the systemic problem of Iran expertise, because there are people within the establishment who have been saying what I've been saying for a long time, but because of the incentive structures and the disciplining factors, if you're younger, if you're sort of more critical within the community, you will be punished for coming out too strongly. So a lot of times people felt that they could say things to me because I don't identify any of my interlocutors in any of my research. And I tried to do that in an article as well, as I don't name names. This is not a shaming practice for me. I have no intention to do that. That's not interesting to me. What I want to show is that even very good people who can go into this industry can get eaten up by it because of those disciplining factors, right? And they get silenced in various ways. And I would make the joke that I was in DC to study the tribe of the policy wonk, you know? And they all loved it. So many of my interlocutors ran with it and said, yeah, if you say the wrong thing, you get kicked out of the tribe, you know?
Interesting.
It's like a true anthropologist.
Yeah, right?
But do you at least name the think tanks?
I do name think tanks.
Okay. Which ones can you name right now for us?
In terms of who are doing...
Where is this knowledge being produced in terms of policy?
So I'm naming, I mean, it's all of the think tanks. There's so many of them. I just recently wrote a list for somebody, and I think I came up with 25 think tanks that have at least one person who works on the Middle East, if not specifically Iran. And those are sort of the mainstream think tanks. There's a lot of 2-3 person think tanks that are out there.
And at the end of the day, I know this from personal experience in connecting and actually trying to interview people at think tanks over a few years.
Yeah.
And I also know it from my teaching, people seeking jobs.
Yeah.
I know this also from, mainly actually from the Knowledge Production Project and the Think Tanks database. By the way, which everyone can check it out at knowledgeproduction.com. Now, the idea is that it's really easy to get an Iran expert into these think tanks, because what is needed is not somebody who knows the history, politics, forget culture and language even, but it's not about somebody who knows the history and politics and the domestic environment, the domestic landscape, political landscape of Iran.
Right.
It's more seeking someone who is willing to reinforce existing discourses, and that doesn't take so much expertise, and that doesn't take a lot of language and cultural learning, or even visits and so on and so forth. So it's very similar to other lobbies, whether it's the oil lobby or the weapons manufacturing lobby and so on and so forth. So that's why it's really that's why I started with talking about comparisons, because it's very similar to other situations.
Absolutely. And I don't want to say that Iran is exceptional.
No, you're not
either.
saying that.
Yeah,
you're not saying that. I'm just pointing that out because we do wish to actually go on and try to sort of make a broader argument, not just not just in terms of writing the articles, but also in presenting the data that we have on think tanks.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we, because I know that people have to leave before rush hour, and it's okay, we say everything here, and I'm also hungry, to be honest with you, and Noura probably has to do. I think you have to
Whatever
work out.
it is.
Noura has to work out. Okay, so let's look at some of these Twitter comments that have been prepared by our communications director, Mary Kate Smith, and it's basically like a story. Starts with this tweet about the article that was very very much responded to in various ways. This is you responding and highlighting something from the piece, and then tons of other tweets that have been actually addressed, and of course here another plug for anthropology. Anthropologist says her fieldwork in DC found that half of the Iran experts based at think tanks in DC could not read, write, and so on and so forth.
How much of the reaction, because this was also my reaction, I was so taken that you identify as a political anthropologist.
Yeah.
I think that there's some relief that you are studying the policy wonk tribe, rather than this idea of the anthropologist studies all those others.
Right.
That you brought it home.
Right.
Have you received that reaction as well? Has that been an interest in your work generally?
Yeah. I'm an unusual anthropologist, but I'm not the only one, and there's a lot of us who are also trying to critique the history and legacy of our own discipline in terms of always studying the other and studying across or studying communities that don't have as much power. The idea that Laura Nader said in 1969 was, we need to study people in positions of power using the same tools.
And you're doing it.
And I'm not the only one. Yeah.
This is why this is so incredible.
This is Shiva Balaghi, who is a friend of ours and of our
An amazing scholar.
publication, who's made this interesting point, because in response to a lot of the claims that, you don't need this, you don't need that.
Right.
I mean, seriously, how can we take seriously someone who doesn't know the language, the English language?
Yeah.
Forget visiting in the United States. and is pretending or presenting themselves as the expert, and not only that, and is part of a cohort that represents
Right.
the plurality, if not the majority, of
Right.
U.S. experts elsewhere, where, one more thing,
Yeah.
where decisions are actually
Right.
important and have consequences.
Consequential.
Yeah. Well, or even take my own project. Let's say I wanted to do my project. I sat in Iran, did my project. I don't speak English. I never communicated with a single person from the foreign policy community. What would they say about the validity of my project?
It's not credible.
Right.
You can't get a job.
Right.
And can't teach our students.
Yeah, and yet that's okay when it goes the other direction.
Of course, there are a lot of like really interesting revelations that were made. So we selected a few of these tweets, but let's go to one critique sort of towards the end. Excellent article, phony expertise. We're not supposed to laugh. We're supposed to be professional. Whoa, what? Why are people surprised? This is also an interesting sign.
Yeah.
Okay, so we go back to, hey, Samer, hi. All right, we go back to
There it is.
this
Yeah,
piece.
Yeganen. Yeah.
Nurla is trying to move the screen with her hands, thinking this is CNN. We're not there yet.
No.
I
She
thought
was
you were
pointing you in the right direction.
I was trying to be a good teammate.
Actually, it'd be nice if we have something.
Yeah, that
Don't-
touch screen.
No,
Give him ideas.
I can't actually. I can't do it because then I'll think of Wolf Blitzer and everything will
and
fall
start
apart.
like,
No, can't do that. It's gonna be a while. So what do you think? I know you responded with
I
the 4 parts.
responded.
So maybe
Yeah.
it's a bit strange to criticize experts for not visiting Iran or
Right.
doing field work there while omitting the crucial context of the Iranian government's consistent practice of arresting academics, journalists, and others. So, and you already responded, so we'd love to hear more.
Yeah, and I think this was a very legitimate critique of my piece, and that's why I felt the need to respond to it on Twitter. But no one knows better than Iranian American scholars how difficult it is to do research inside Iran and how dangerous that can be. And there are unfortunately 2 anthropologists behind bars right now in Iran, both of them dual nationals. The list is very long of people who have had to go through this, journalists, etc. It was almost so obvious I didn't think it needed to be said. But that was my mistake, because if I am going to be critiquing people for not going there, I should clarify that I understand the complications of going and doing research there. That said, there are people who have gone.
To point out.
Yeah, there are people who have gone on visas, including from think tanks. There are people who have gone as academics. There are people who have gone as journalists. And this is not, I don't think that any one person can say, if you have these list of qualifications, you are an Iran expert. Anybody who has that level of arrogance is not someone that, is being honest about this discussion. That's not what I was trying to say. What I was trying to say is that people give the impression when they are presenting their
That they
research
know,
that
yeah.
they have been there or they have that level of access to the country. And you can access the country through reading news articles, interviewing people remotely, or engaging with Iranian culture through its media, through its popular films, etc. But then you need to have the language. So it's sort of the combination of the two that needs to be. You can't separate one from the other. Okay, you can't go to Iran. It's not safe for you to go to Iran. Absolutely, I understand that. But what's stopping you from learning Farsi if you're claiming that you are an expert on this country?
And learning about the political landscape. I mean,
Yeah.
my issue is that people don't have, not everyone, of
Yeah.
course, but there is a marked lack of knowledge about the political landscape inside Iran. And by the way,
Right.
to be honest, this is not something that just think tank folks have.
Right.
Even people like in my circles in our academy in Middle East studies,
Yeah.
a lot of people don't know very much about inside Iran. They know a lot about Iran's
Right.
geopolitical situation
Right.
and geopolitical
Right.
interests, but very little about Iran in itself. And there's the flip side of this whole argument.
Yeah.
When you hear people say, "Oh, yeah, I know the Middle East. I've been to Jordan once. I took a language course." And they're like, "What?"
I was in a
so
taxi.
the visit is in and of itself not necessarily.
Tom for you.
I talked to 2 taxi drivers. Of course, I mean, beyond Tom, I've heard this from so many people.
Right.
So
The
Right.
anecdotal knowledge.
Right.
I've
Right.
seen. In fact, on my visit to Iran, which I was
Yeah.
really lucky to be on, one of the
That's
things that I
amazing.
found really interesting is that even if you do visit,
Yeah.
you're not really getting the story because
Right.
so much is happening in more intimate spaces
Sure.
anyway.
Sure.
So
Or you have a
there's also-
minder who's watching everything you do.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
even then,
Yeah.
there's a lot of stages, and I think that your
Absolutely.
point is not that this is you must
You
visit
must
in
have
order,
it.
but there has to be some sort of familiarity.
Yeah.
If it's not that proximity, it should be through language. Be through other sources.
Right, right.
And an attempt to understand it.
Yeah,
on its terms.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I make 2 points from what you both just said?
Sorry. No.
Time's up.
All right, one is I think there's an ideological bias against Iran to say that they even have politics, right? To even believe that
Right.
they have a political life and that ordinary people matter. There's this discourse in Washington that's quite popular that anything the supreme leader says is what happens. And that's such a misunderstanding about how politics works in a country like Iran. And so even if that's your starting point, you will always continue to reify that notion of power in the country, is that they don't have politics.
And the alternative is that, not the alternative, another perception is there is no diversity
Yes.
in terms of, I mean, like there are no liberals, there are no communists, there
Yeah.
are no, of course they know there are Islamists, they know that really well or too well, but it's like they don't know
Yeah.
that there's diversity.
Yeah.
And when diversity is addressed, it's not taken very seriously.
That's right.
Kind of like, with the attack or the invasion of Iraq,
Yeah.
whereby the assumption was, yeah, Saddam Hussein might work with bin Laden. What stops them from doing so? It's like they don't take the
Right.
political orientation and the ideologies
Yeah, the
seriously.
history, the political history of that country, what was their relationship with some other regime.
And this was
Yeah.
discussed in 1957, interestingly, an article that I still teach until today, short piece,
Yeah.
3-page piece by Walid Khalidi, talking about the British addressing their former colonies and how they actually don't take their politics, their political views and positions seriously,
Seriously.
even when they can acknowledge them.
Right.
So there's a very deep, undertone here
Yeah.
that operates, that makes this idea of visiting, not visiting the country,
Right.
like important, especially for those people because
Yeah.
of the assumptions that it's just a glob of people. It's a glob of, it's just one monolithic thing.
Yes.
And can be actually extrapolated to
Right.
cover the entire region,
Right.
not just Iran.
Right, exactly. It's like, I'm not saying that you have to go to Iran, but what would you gain from going to Iran? And what about talking to the people who have been able to get that access? Why not highlight their stories? Give them more platforms to talk.
Exactly.
Right? Like there are people who have been able to do really substantive research inside Iran, unraveling the complexities of the political system there. Why not talk to them
And
and
when
have that
they-
humility?
You had a second point.
Yeah.
So there were 2 points. The first
No, I
was-
lost it.
oh,
It had to do with what you were saying about going to a country and
On its
only
own
seeing
terms.
yes,
Yes,
yes, and
intimate spaces
and yeah, exactly. So again, I don't want to bring in Egypt too much, but I in my dissertation I have a section called like 3 cups of tea in the Nile Hilton, which is there is also this fetishization of, okay, I went there and I spoke to English-speaking elites, and now I know the country. And so I'm not advocating for that in Iran either, that you just go and you speak to the people who are designated to you. But let's ask these questions, right? And like let's not just hide behind, I've been to the country and that's it. That's my credibility.
And the one thing that I want to say and sort of close my bit with
Yeah.
is that even according to what you just said, or based on what you just said,
Yeah.
even when the diversity of the Iranian political arena is addressed,
Yeah.
what is highlighted is this binary between the very conservative,
Mm-hmm.
rigid ayatollahs, if you will, and the religious establishment,
Yeah.
and the alternative is a pro-Western liberal bloc, as
Right.
if there's nothing else,
Right.
and as if this is actually the saving grace of Iran,
Right.
which
Right.
comports and coincides with U.S. foreign policy
Yeah.
from that perspective, and
Yeah.
that actually is a very dangerous
Yes.
viewpoint, and it's actually popular,
Yeah.
and people think, oh, there is diversity in Iran, and
Yeah.
this is the face of it.
And unfortunately, the Iranian diaspora in America has been huge in creating that narrative to be like, no, they have their own Islamophobic issues in our community. We can do a whole other session on that. And a lot of anti-Arab sentiment within the Iranian community. in the U.S.
That's not nice.
I know. And so those things feed into, when Lindsey Graham says, I know Iranians, he's talking about the Iranians that lived in South Carolina who left before the Shah left, and they have a very specific orientation, and they have a specific narrative that they want to give. And
Or Los Angeles.
Or Los Angeles, or, wherever, where they have an agenda. And you need someone who understands those complexities within the diasporic community, and there are experts on that. They're just not being called in.
And that totally and exactly highlights, this point of it's not just the, knowledge of certain people, anecdotal knowledge, even visiting, that you're aspiring to another level of complexity and nuance and insisting on that.
Yeah.
But based on that and the fact that you did bring up Egypt, can we
Yeah.
segue a little bit to one of the concerns that you raised?
Yeah, sure.
Which is that, so here we have 25 think tanks. This is what they're producing, their mainstream.
At least 25. There's
At
more.
least 25,
Yeah.
right? So the flip side of that is there are two things.
Yeah.
There isn't an opposition. There isn't an outlier or a significant outlier to be able to challenge that.
You mean within
force
Washington?
Within
Yeah.
Washington, right? In terms of the Iranian think tank circuit of having a progressive, there's exceptions obviously.
Yeah.
But the other part is, what about the experts they hire? So, can you tell our non-viewers about, your finding with experts on Egypt?
Yeah. So there are people who have way more grounds to call themselves Egypt experts within the think tank community. But one of the problems is that I don't know how to say this.
Do you not want to say it?
No. It's just that I didn't
Say it in Persian.
formulate. Say it in Persian. No, okay. So I want to say that.
I mean, according to your article, nobody's gonna get it.
Yeah, no one's gonna get it. So.
No, in Persian.
So what I wanted to say is that there are people who are working on Egypt who are much more sophisticated and have the language or have the access, have at least the desire to try to understand Egypt as a complicated political entity. The problem is there's not a lot of space for Egyptians who have left Egypt to be a part of that discourse, even though there was a lot of support for what happened in 2011 for the liberal voices, or even some of the more Islamist voices. When they came to Washington out of fear for their lives, they had to leave Egypt. A lot of space was not made for them to be active participants in the debate. The Egypt Working Group doesn't have a single Egyptian on it.
Which it affirms your point that the establishment is basically listening to somebody who's already going to tell them what it is that they want to fulfill.
Right.
So it's this,
and it also leads to another point you just reminded me.
Yeah.
It's this notion that people from the region are inherently biased,
right.
and people here are not. And that's really fundamentally a problem. And it affects Egypt in some ways more than Iran, because people can say, well, we don't want an Egyptian on the Egypt Working Group because this is about US interests, and an Egyptian American wouldn't be unbiased. Okay, but the people sitting in that room have plenty of biases. Let's just be open about that, right?
Egyptian American who's also part of the U.S.
Yeah, and probably lived their entire life here. Yeah, exactly.
And this is the same thing in the academy, right?
Right.
This idea of if you're proximate, therefore you're biased.
Right.
But that's a whole set of assumptions that anybody can act with any objectivity.
Yeah.
At all.
And somehow being from the region makes you inherently biased in a way that someone who didn't learn the language here, didn't take time to go learn anything about the culture or politics of that country is somehow not biased.
Unless you support U.S. foreign policy.
That's the only bias that matters.
Okay.
Right?
It's a qualifying bias.
Yeah, it's a qualifying bias.
Negar, unless Noura has other comments, because I know we kept you for longer than we,
This was
probably a bit
fun.
longer than we said
This
we
was
would.
fun.
Is there anything else that you'd like to close with? Particularly on the question of, the future moving forward, do you see that the issues that you pointed out, do you see them being exacerbated in a negative way, or do you see some easing as a function of some sort of self-reflection based on the failure of policies,
Right.
potentially based on change in administration? Although I don't have a lot of faith in that,
Yeah.
in the sense that if there's another administration, it's not going to solve,
Right.
the core of the problem.
Yeah.
It might just make it sweeter on the edges.
Right. I will leave on a cautiously optimistic note in the sense of I think a conversation is being had about these issues, and I think that's important. Is it going to create a structural change overnight? Absolutely not. It may not even take another administration, 2 administrations, but at least we should be having these conversations. We should be raising these questions. When an expert comes forward and makes a claim about Iran, I hope that the person interviewing them asks them maybe some questions about conflict of interest. In particular, I'm most disturbed by conflict of interest. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, but if you are being funded by a regional government that has a direct stake in the outcome of your research and you don't say that up front, that's a conflict of interest. Or worse, you work for a consulting firm that directly advises that government in the region. You're doing proprietary work for that government. There is a clear conflict of interest. And so at least let's start asking the questions. That's a starting point. People shouldn't feel comfortable that, I put my idea out there and it'll never be questioned.
We promise you on this show, we will ask that question every time.
Thank you so much, Negar.
Thank you.
Noda.
Thank you.
I'd like
This
to
is a lot of
thank
fun.
Noah, who
Thank
is
you.
behind the cameras, and Khalid, as well as Mary Kate and Kylie, who have helped us put together some of the production here. And we'd love to have you back to talk
great.
about this issue, perhaps with others, addressing the question, but in relation to other countries. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
all.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.